This video may contain offensive language and be frightening to some viewers. Viewer discretion is recommended. Excerpt from a local newspaper. Ominous unknown killer is still at large. After weeks of unexplained murders, the ominous unknown killer is still on the rise. After little evidence has been found, a young boy states that he survived one of the killer's attacks and bravely tells his story. "I had a bad dream, and I woke up in the middle of the night," says the boy. "I saw that for some reason the window was open, even though I remember it being closed before I went to bed. I got up and shut it once more. Afterwards, I simply crawled under my covers and tried to get back to sleep. That's when I had a strange feeling, like someone was watching me. I looked up and nearly jumped out of my bed. There, in the little ray of light escaping from between my curtains, were a pair of eyes. They weren't regular eyes. They were dark, ominous eyes. They were bordered in black and just plain terrified me. That's when I saw his mouth, a long horrendous smile that made every hair on my body stand up. The figure stood there, watching me. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he said it. A simple phrase, but said in a way only a madman could speak. He said, "Go to sleep." I let out a scream. That's what sent him at me. He pulled up a knife, aimed at my heart. He jumped on top of my bed. I fought him back. I kicked, I punched, I rolled around, trying to knock him off me. That's when my dad rushed in. The man threw the knife. It went into my dad's shoulder. The man likely would have finished him off if it wasn't for one of the neighbours who had alerted the police. They drove into the parking lot and ran towards the door. The man turned and ran down the hallway. I heard a smash, like glass breaking. As I came out of my room, I saw the window that was pointing towards the back of my house was broken. I looked out of it to see him vanish into the distance. I can tell you one thing. I will never forget that face. Those cold, evil eyes. And that psychotic smile. They will never leave my mind. Police are still on the lookout for this man. If you see anyone that fits the description in this story, please contact your local police department. Jeff and his family had just moved into a new neighbourhood. His dad had got a promotion at work, and they thought it'd be best to live in one of those fancy neighbourhoods. Jeff and his brother Lou couldn't complain though. A new better house, what was not to love? As they were getting unpacked, one of their neighbours came by. "Hello," she said. "I'm Barbara. I live across the street from you. Well, I just wanted to introduce myself and to introduce my son." She turns around and calls her son over. "Billy, these are our new neighbours." Billy said hi and ran back to play in his yard. "Well, I'm Margaret," said Jeff's mum. "And this is my husband Peter, and my two sons, Jeff and Lou." They each introduced themselves, and then Barbara invited them to her son's birthday. Jeff and his brother were about to object when their mother said that they would love to. When Jeff and his family had done unpacking, Jeff went up to his mum. "Mum, why would you invite us to some random kid's party? If you haven't noticed, I'm not some dumb kid." "Jeff," said his mother, "we just moved here. We should show that we want to spend time with our neighbours. Now we're going to that party, and that's final." Jeff started to talk, but stopped himself, knowing that he couldn't do anything. It seemed like whenever his mum said something, it was final. He walked up to his room and plopped down on his bed. He sat there looking at his ceiling, when suddenly he got a weird feeling. Not so much a pain, but a weird feeling. He dismissed it. It was just some random feeling. He heard his mother calling him down to get his stuff, and he walked down to get it. The next day, Jeff walked down the stairs to get breakfast and to get ready for school. As he sat there eating his breakfast, he once again got that feeling. This time it was stronger. It gave him a slight tugging pain, but once again he dismissed it. As he and Lou finished breakfast, they walked down to the bus stop. They sat there waiting for the bus, and then, all of a sudden, some kid on a skateboard jumped over them, only inches away from their laps. They both jumped back in surprise. "Hey, what the hell?" The kid landed and turned back to them. He kicks his skateboard up and caught it with his hands. The kid seems to be about 12, 1 year younger than Jeff. He wears an 𝚑𝚘𝚛𝚜𝚎 shirt and ripped blue jeans. Well, well, well. It looks like we got some new meat. Suddenly 2 other kids appeared. One was super skinny and the other was huge. "Well, since you're new here, I'd like to introduce ourselves. Over there is Keith." Jeff and Lou looked over to the skinny kid. He had a dopey face that you'd expect a sidekick to have. "And here's Troy." They looked over to the fat kid. Talk about a tub of lard. This kid looked like he hadn't exercised since he was crawling. "And I," said the first kid, "am Randy. Now for all the kids in this neighbourhood, there is a small price for bus fare, if you catch my drift." Lou stood up, ready to punch the lights out of this kid's eyes when one of his friends pulled a knife on him. "I had hoped you'd be more cooperative, but it seems we must do this the hard way." The kid walked up to Lou and took his wallet out of his pocket. Jeff got that feeling again. Now it was truly strong, a burning sensation. He stood up, but Lou gestured him to sit down. Jeff ignored him and walked up to the kid. "Listen here, you little punk. Give back my bro's wallet or else." Randy put the wallet in his pocket and pulled out his own knife. "Oh? And what will you do?" Just as he finished the sentence, Jeff popped the kid in the nose. As Randy reached for his face, Jeff grabbed the kid's wrist and broke it. Randy screamed and Jeff grabbed the knife from his hand. Keith and Troy rushed at Jeff, but Jeff was too quick. He threw Randy to the ground. Keith lashed out at him, but Jeff ducked and stabbed him in the arm. Keith dropped his knife and fell to the ground screaming. Troy rushed him too, but Jeff didn't even need the knife. He just punched Troy straight in the stomach, and Troy went down. As he fell, he puked all over. Lou could do nothing but look in amazement at Jeff. "Jeff, how do you..." That was all he said. They saw the bus coming, and they knew they'd be blamed for the whole thing, so they started running as fast as they could. As they ran, they looked back and saw the bus driver rushing over to Randy and the others. As Jeff and Lou made it back to school, they didn't dare tell anyone what happened. All they did was sit and listen. Lou just thought of it as his brother beating up a few kids, but Jeff knew it was something more. It was something scary. As he got that feeling, he felt how powerful it was. The urge to just hurt someone. He didn't like how it sounded, but he couldn't help but feel happy. He felt that strange feeling go away, and stay away for the entire day of school. Even as he walked home, due to the whole thing happening near the bus stop, and how now he probably wouldn't be taking the bus anymore, he felt happy. When he got home, his parents asked him how his day was, and he said, in a somewhat ominous voice, "It was a wonderful day." Next morning, he heard a knock on his front door. He walked down to find 2 police officers at the door, his mother looking back at him with an angry look. "Jeff, these officers tell me you attacked 3 kids, that it wasn't regular fighting, and that they were stabbed. Stabbed, son!" Jeff's gaze fell to the floor, showing his mother that it was true. "Mum, they were the ones who pulled the knives on me and Lou." "Son," said one of the officers, "we found 3 kids, 2 stabbed, 1 having a bruise on his stomach, and we have witnesses proving that you fled the scene. Now what does that tell us?" Jeff knew it was no use. He could say him and Lou had been attacked, but then there was no proof it was them who had not attacked first. They couldn't say that they weren't fleeing, because truth be told they were. So Jeff couldn't defend himself or Lou. "Son, call down your brother." Jeff couldn't do it, since it was him who beat up all the kids. "Sir, it was me. I was the one who beat up the kids. Lou tried to hold me back, but he couldn't stop me." The cop looked at his partner, and they both nod. "Well, kid, looks like a year in juvie." "Wait," said Lou. They all looked up to see him holding a knife. The officers pulled their guns and locked them on Lou. "It was me. I beat up those little punks. I have the marks to prove it." He lifted up his sleeves to reveal cuts and bruises, as if he had been in a struggle. "Son, just put the knife down," said the officer. Lou held up the knife and dropped it to the ground. He put his hands up and walked over to the cops. "No, Lou, it was me. I did it." Jeff had tears running down his face. "Huh? Poor bro. Trying to take the blame for what I did. Well, take me away." The police led Lou out to the patrol car. "Lou, tell them it was me. Tell them. I was the one who beat up those kids." Jeff's mother put her hands on his shoulders. "Jeff, please. You don't have to lie. We know it's Lou. You can stop." Jeff watched helplessly as the cop car speeds off with Lou inside. A few minutes later, Jeff's dad pulled into the driveway, seeing Jeff's face and knowing something was wrong. "Son, what is it?" Jeff couldn't answer. His vocal cords were strained from crying. Instead, Jeff's mother walked his father inside to break the bad news to him, as Jeff wept in the driveway. After an hour or so, Jeff walked back into the house, seeing that his parents were both shocked, sad, and disappointed. He couldn't look at them. He couldn't see how they thought of Lou when it was his fault. He just went to sleep, trying to get the whole thing off his mind. 2 days went by, with no word from Lou at the JDC. No friends to hang out with, nothing but sadness and guilt. This is until Saturday, when Jeff is woken up by his mother with a happy, sunshiny face. "Jeff, it's the day," she said as she opened up the curtains and let light flood into his room. "What? What's today?" groaned Jeff as he stirred awake. "Why, it's Billy's party today." He was now fully awake. "Mum, you're joking, right? You don't expect me to go to some kid's party after..." There was a long pause. "Jeff, we both know what happened. I think this party could be the thing that brightens up the past days. Now get dressed." Jeff's mother walked out of the room and downstairs to get ready herself. He fought himself to get up. He picked out a random shirt and a pair of jeans and walked downstairs. He saw his mother and father all dressed up, his mother in a dress and his father in a suit. He thought to himself, why would they ever wear such fancy clothes to a kid's party? "Jeff, is that really what you're going to wear?" said Jeff's mum. "Better than wearing too much," he said. His mother pushed down the urge to yell at him and hid it with a smile. "Now Jeff, we might be overdressed, but this is how you go if you want to make an impression," said his father. Jeff grunted and went back up to his room. "I don't have any fancy clothes," he yelled downstairs. "Just pick out something," called his mother. He looked around in his closet for what he would call fancy. He found a pair of black dress pants he had for special occasions and an undershirt. He couldn't find a shirt to go with it though. He looked around and only found striped and patterned shirts, none of which go with dress pants. Finally, he found a white hoodie and put it on. You're wearing that? They both said. His mother looked at her watch. "Oh, no time to change, let's just go," she said as she herded Jeff and his father out the door. They crossed the street over to Barbara and Billy's house. They knocked on the door, and at it appeared Barbara, just like his parents, way overdressed. As they walked inside, all Jeff could see were adults, no kids. "The kids are out in the yard, Jeff. How about you go and meet some of them?" said Barbara. Jeff walked outside to a yard full of kids. They were running around in weird cowboy costumes and shooting each other with plastic guns. He might as well be standing in a Toys R Us. Suddenly a kid came up to him and handed him a toy gun and hat. "Hey, wanna play?" he said. No kid. I'm way too old for this stuff." The kid looked at him with that weird puppy dog face. "Please?" said the kid. "Fine," said Jeff. He put on the hat and started to pretend to shoot the kids. At first he thought it was totally ridiculous, but then he started to actually have fun. It might not have been super cool, but it was the first time he had done something that had taken his mind off of Lou. So he played with the kids for a while, until he heard a noise. A weird rolling noise. Then it hit him. Randy, Troy and Keith all jumped over the fence on their skateboards. Jeff dropped the fake gun and ripped off the hat. Randy looked at Jeff with a burning hatred. "Hello, Jeff, is it?" he said. "We have some unfinished business." Jeff saw his bruised nose. "I think we're even. I beat the crap out of you and you got my brother sent to JDC. Randy got an angry look in his eyes. "Oh no. I don't go for even. I go for winning. You may have kicked our asses that one day, but not today." As he said that, Randy rushed at Jeff. They both fell to the ground. Randy punched Jeff in the nose and Jeff grabbed him by the ears and headbutted him. Jeff pushed Randy off of him and they both rose to their feet. Kids were screaming and parents were running out of the house. Troy and Keith both pulled guns out of their pockets. "No one interrupts us or guts will fly," they said. Randy pulled a knife on Jeff and stabbed him in the shoulder. Jeff screamed and fell to his knees. Randy started kicking him in the face. After 3 kicks, Jeff grabbed his foot and twisted it, causing Randy to fall on the ground. Jeff stood up and walked towards the back door. Troy grabbed him. "Need some help?" He picks Jeff up by the back of the collar and throws him through the patio door. As Jeff tries to stand, he is kicked down to the ground. Randy repeatedly starts kicking Jeff until he starts coughing up blood. "Come on, Jeff, fight me." He picks Jeff up and throws him into the kitchen. Randy sees a bottle of vodka on the counter and smashes the glass over Jeff's head. "Fight!" He throws Jeff back into the living room. "Come on, Jeff, look at me." Jeff glances up, his face riddled with blood. "I was the one who got your brother sent to JDC. And now you're just gonna sit here and let him rot in there for a whole year? You should be ashamed." Jeff starts to get up. "Oh, finally, you stand and fight." Jeff is now on his feet, blood and vodka on his face. Once again he gets that strange feeling, the one he hasn't felt for some time now. "Finally he's up," says Randy as he runs at Jeff. That's when it happens. Something inside of Jeff snaps. His psyche is destroyed. All rational thinking is gone. All he can do is kill. He grabs Randy and pile drives him to the ground. He gets on top of him and punches him straight in the heart. The punch causes Randy's heart to stop. As Randy gasps for breath, Jeff hammers down on him, punch after punch, blood gushing from Randy's body until he takes one final breath and dies. Everyone is looking at Jeff now. The parents, the crying kids, even Troy and Keith, although they easily break from their gaze and point their guns at Jeff. Jeff sees the guns trained on him and runs for the stairs. As he runs, Troy and Keith let out fire on him. Each shot missing, Jeff runs up the stairs. He hears Troy and Keith follow up behind. As they let out their final rounds of bullets, Jeff ducks into the bathroom. He grabs a towel rack and rips it off the wall. Troy and Keith race in, knives ready. Troy swings his knife at Jeff, who backs away and bangs the towel rack into Troy's face. Troy goes down hard, and now all that's left is Keith. He is more agile than Troy though, and ducks when Jeff swings the towel rack. He dropped the knife and grabbed Jeff by the neck. He pushed him into the wall. A bottle of bleach fell down on top of him from the top shelf. It burnt both of them, and they both started to scream. Jeff wiped his eyes as best as he could. He pulled back the towel rack and swung it straight into Keith's head. As he lay there bleeding to death, an ominous smile broke out on his face. "What's so funny?" asked Jeff. Keith pulled out a lighter and flicked it on. "What's funny," he said, "is that you're covered in bleach and alcohol." Jeff's eyes widened as Keith threw the lighter at him. As soon as the flame made contact with him, the flames ignited the alcohol in the vodka. While the alcohol burned him, the bleach bleached his skin. Jeff let out a terrible screech as he caught on fire. He tried to roll out the fire, but it was no use. The alcohol had made him a walking inferno. He ran down the hall and fell down the stairs. Everybody started screaming as they saw Jeff, now a man on fire, drop to the ground, nearly dead. The last thing Jeff saw was his mother and the other parents trying to extinguish the flames. That's when he passed out. When Jeff woke, he had a cast wrapped around his face. He couldn't see anything, but he felt a cast on his shoulder and stitches all over his body. He tried to stand up, but he realised there was some tube in his arm. And when he tried to get up, it fell out, and a nurse rushed in. "I don't think you can get out of bed just yet," she said as she put him back in his bed and reinserted the tube. Jeff sat there, with no vision, no idea of what his surroundings were. Finally, after hours, he heard his mother. "Honey, are you okay?" she asked. Jeff couldn't answer though. His face was covered, and he was unable to speak. "Oh, honey, I have some great news. After all the witnesses told the police that Randy confessed to trying to attack you, they decided to let Lou go." This made Jeff almost bolt up, stopping halfway, remembering the tube coming out of his arm. "He'll be out by tomorrow, and then you two will be able to be together again." Jeff's mother hugs Jeff and says her goodbyes. The next couple of weeks were those where Jeff was visited by his family. Then came the day where his bandages were to be removed. His family were all there to see it, what he would look like. As the doctors unwrapped the bandages from Jeff's face, everyone was on the edge of their seats. They waited until the last bandage holding the cover over his face was almost removed. "Let's hope for the best," said the doctor. He quickly pulls the cloth, letting the rest fall from Jeff's face. Jeff's mother screams at the sight of his face. Lou and Jeff's dad stare awestruck. What happened to my face?" Jeff said. He rushed out of bed and ran to the bathroom. He looked in the mirror and saw the cause of the distress. His face. It's horrible. His lips were burnt to a deep shade of red. His face was turned into a purple-white colour, and his hair singed from brown to black. He slowly put his hand to his face. It had a sort of leathery feel to it now. He looked back at his family, then back at the mirror. "Jeff," said Lou, "it's not that bad." "Not that bad?" said Jeff. "It's perfect." His family were equally surprised. Jeff started laughing uncontrollably. His parents noticed that his left eye and hand were twitching. Jeff? Are you okay?" "Okay? I've never felt more happy." "Look at me. This face goes perfectly with me." He couldn't stop laughing. He was stroking his face, feeling it, looking at it in the mirror. What caused this? Well, you may recall that when Jeff was fighting Randy, something in his mind, his sanity snapped. Now he was left as a crazy killing machine. That is, his parents didn't know. "Doctor," said Jeff's mum, "is my son alright? You know, in the head?" "Oh yes, this behaviour is typical for patients who have taken large amounts of painkillers. If this behaviour doesn't change in a few weeks, bring him back here and we'll give him a psychological test." "Oh, thank you, doctor." Jeff's mother went over to Jeff. "Jeff, sweetie, it's time to go home." Jeff looks away from the mirror. His face still formed into a crazy smile. "'Kay, mummy." Unsettled, his mother took him by the shoulder to get his clothes. "This is what came in," said the lady at the desk. Jeff's mum looked down to see the black dress pants and white hoodie her son had worn. Now they were cleaned of blood and stitched back together. Jeff's mother led him to his room and helped him put his clothes on. Then they left, not knowing that this was their final day of life. Later that night, Jeff's mother woke to a sound coming from the bathroom. It sounded as if someone was crying. She slowly walked over to see what it was. When she looked into the bathroom, she saw a horrendous sight. Jeff had taken a knife and carved a smile into his cheeks. "Jeff, what are you doing?" asked his mother. Jeff looked over to his mother. "I couldn't keep smiling, Mummy. It hurt after a while. Now I can smile forever." Jeff's mother noticed his eyes ringed in black. "Jeff, your eyes." His eyes were seemingly never closing. "I couldn't see my face. I got tired and my eyes started to close. I burned off the eyelids so I could forever see myself, my new face." Jeff's mother slowly started to back away, seeing that her son was going insane. "What's wrong, Mummy? Aren't I beautiful?" "Yes, son," she said. "Yes, you are. Let me go get Daddy so he can see your face." She ran into the room and shook Jeff's dad from his sleep. "Honey, get the gun, She stopped as she saw Jeff in the doorway, holding a knife. "Mummy, you lied." That's the last thing they would hear as Jeff rushes them with the knife, gutting both of them. His little brother Lou woke up, startled by some noise. He didn't hear anything else, so he just shut his eyes and tried to go back to sleep. As he was on the border of slumber, he got the strangest feeling that someone was watching him. He looked up. Before Jeff's hand covered his mouth, he slowly raised the knife, ready to plunge it into Lou. Lou thrashed here and there, trying to escape Jeff's grip. "Shh," Jeff said. "Just go to sleep." It was a nice summer day. My 5-year-old son James was playing outside in the backyard of our suburban home. James has always been a quiet boy. He plays by himself mostly. He never had many friends, but he has always had a wild imagination. I was in the kitchen feeding our dog Fido when I heard what sounded like James talking to someone in the backyard. I'm not sure who it was he could be talking to. Could he have finally made a friend? Being a single mum, it was hard for me to always keep up with my son, so I decided to go outside and check on him. When I went into the backyard, I was a bit confused, because James was the only person back there. Was he talking to himself? I could have sworn I had heard another voice. "James, it's time to come inside," I called out to him. He came inside and sat down at the kitchen table. It was about lunchtime, so I decided to make him a turkey sandwich. "James, who were you talking to out there?" I asked. James looked up for a moment. "I was playing with my new friend," he said, smiling. I poured him some milk and continued to pry, as any good mother would do. "Does your friend have a name? Why didn't you ask him to have lunch with us?" James stared at me for a moment before replying. "His name is Laughing Jack." I was a bit taken aback by what he had said. "Oh, that's a strange name. What does your friend look like?" I asked, a bit confused. "He's a clown. He has long hair and a big swirly cone nose. He's got long arms and baggy pants, with stripy socks, and he always smiles." I realised my son was talking about his imaginary friend. I suppose it's normal for kids at his age to have imaginary friends, especially when he has no real kids to play with. It's probably just a phase. The rest of the day went by as per usual, and it was starting to get late, so I put James to bed. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and made sure to turn on his nightlight before I closed the door. I was pretty tired myself, so I decided to go to bed not long after. Shortly after falling asleep, I had an awful nightmare. It was dark. I was in some kind of run-down amusement park. I was scared, running through an endless field of empty tents, broken down rides and abandoned game huts. The whole place had a horrible look to it. Everything was black and white, and the prized stuffed animals hung from nooses in the game huts, all with sick, twisted grins stitched on their faces. I felt like the whole park was looking at me, even though there wasn't another living thing in sight. Then suddenly, I began to hear music play. The sounds of Pop Goes the Weasel being played on a squeezy box echoed through the park. It was hypnotizing. I followed its tune to the circus tent almost in a trance, unable to stop my legs from moving forward. It was pitch black. The only light came from a single spotlight shining on the center of the big top. As I walked towards the light, the music slowed down. I found myself singing along, unable to stop. All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought 'twas all in fun. The music stopped right before its climax, and suddenly the lights shot on. The intensity of the lights was practically blinding. All I could see was a small dark silhouette, slowly shuffling towards me. Then another one appeared, and another, and another. There were dozens of them, all coming towards me. I couldn't move, my legs were frozen. All I could do was watch as the haunting figures drew nearer. As they got closer, I could see. They were children. As I looked at each one, I noticed they were all horribly disfigured and mutated. Some had cuts all over their body. Others were severely burnt, and others missing limbs, even eyes. The children enveloped me, clawing at my flesh, dragging me to the ground and tearing inside me. As the children tore me apart and I faded away, all I could hear was laughter. Horrible, awful, evil laughter. I woke up the next morning in a cold sweat. After taking a few deep breaths, I looked over and saw that a few of James's action figures were positioned facing me on top of my nightstand. I sighed. James had probably woken up early and put these there. I gathered up the toys and made my way to James's room. However, when I opened the door, James was sound asleep. I just shrugged and placed the toys back in his toy box and headed out to the living room. A little while later, James woke up and I made him his breakfast. He was quiet and seemed a bit groggy. Perhaps he didn't sleep well either. I decided to ask him about the toys. James, honey, did you put the toys in Mummy's room this morning? His eyes shot up at me for a moment, then quickly glanced back down at his cereal. Laughing Jack did it. I rolled my eyes and responded, Will you tell Laughing Jack to keep the toys in your room? James nodded and finished up his breakfast, then decided to go play out in the backyard. I went to relax in the living room, and I must have dozed off, because I woke up a couple of hours later. Shit, I need to check on James. I was a bit worried. It had been over 2 hours and I hadn't checked on him. I went out into the backyard, but James wasn't there anymore. I was getting nervous, so I called out to him, James! James, where are you? Just then I heard a giggle come from the front yard. I rushed through the gate, around to the front of the house. James was sitting on the sidewalk. I breathed a sigh of relief and walked over to him. James, how many times have I told you to stay in the back of your... James? What are you eating? James looked up at me, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of hard candies in all colours. This made me very nervous. James, who gave you that candy? James just stared at me, not speaking. James, please tell Mummy where you got that candy. James hung his head down and said, Laughing Jack gave it to me. My heart sunk. I kneeled down to look him in the eye. James, I have had enough with this damn Laughing Jack thing. He is not real. Now this is a very serious situation, and I need to know who gave you the candy." I could see my son's eyes tear up. "But Mum, Laughing Jack did give me the candy." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. James has never lied to me, but what he's telling me is impossible. I make him spit out the candy and throw the rest away. James appears to be fine. Maybe I'm just overreacting. After all, he could have gotten it from Tom and Linda from next door, or Mr. Walker down the street. Either way, I'm going to have to keep a closer eye on James. That night, I put James to bed as usual, and I decided to go to bed early myself. Suddenly, I was woken by a loud bang coming from the kitchen. I sprung out of bed and hurried down the stairs. When I got to the kitchen, I was horrified. Everything on the counters had been thrown on the floor, and our dog Fido hung dead from the light fixture. His stomach was cut open and stuffed with candy, the same type that James was eating earlier that day. My shock was quickly broken by a sharp scream coming from James's room, followed by loud crashes. I quickly grabbed a knife from the drawer and moved up the stairs with the speed only a mother whose child is in danger could have. I burst through the door and flicked on the lights. Everything in the room was knocked over and tossed on the floor. My poor son in his bed crying and shaking with fear, a pool of urine staining the sheets. I scooped my child up and ran out of the house and went next door to Tom and Linda's house. Luckily they were still awake. They let me use their phone and I called the police. It didn't take them long to arrive, and I explained what had happened. They looked at me as if I was crazy. They searched the house, but all they found was a dead dog and 2 trashed rooms. The officer told me that someone had probably gotten into the house and done this right before making a quick escape when they heard me coming up the stairs. I knew it wasn't true. All the doors were locked and none of the windows were open. Whatever was in my house didn't come from outside. The next day, James stayed inside. I didn't want him to leave my sight. I went into the garage and found his old baby monitor and set it up in his room. If anything comes into his room tonight, I was going to be able to hear it. I went into the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife from the drawer and put it on my nightstand. Imaginary friend or not, I'm not letting anything hurt my little boy. Soon enough, night came. I put James to bed. He was afraid, but I promised him that I wasn't going to let anything happen to him. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and turned on the nightlight. Before closing the door, I whispered to him, "Good night, James. I love you." I tried to stay up as long as I could, but after a few hours I felt myself drifting off. My baby would be safe for the night, and I needed to sleep. Just as I lay my head on the pillow, I heard a soft noise coming from the baby monitor I had put on my nightstand. At first it sounded like interference, like the kind of radio would make. Then it turned into a soft moan. Was James asleep? Then I heard it. The laugh from my nightmare, that horrible laugh. I sprung up from my bed and grabbed the knife from under my pillow. I rushed over to James's room and creaked the door open. I tried the light switch, but it wouldn't come on. I took a step in, and I could feel the warm, thick liquid on my feet. Suddenly, James's nightlight came on, and I could see the absolute horror laid out in front of me. James's body was nailed up on the wall, the nails piercing through his hands and feet. His chest was cut wide open, and his organs hung down to the floor. His eyes and tongue had been removed, along with most of his teeth. I was disgusted. I could hardly believe this was my baby boy. Then I heard it again, the soft, desperate moan. James was still alive, my baby, my poor baby, in so much pain, barely clinging to life. I ran across the room and vomited on the floor, but my sickness was interrupted by a horrible crackle coming from behind me. I spun around while still wiping bile from my mouth. Then out of the shadows emerged the fiend responsible for all of this horror. Laughing Jack. His ghost-white skin and matted black hair hung down to his shoulders. He had piercing white eyes, surrounded by dark black rings. His twisted smile revealed a row of sharp, jagged teeth, and his skin didn't look like skin at all. It almost looked like rubber or plastic. He wore a patchy black and white clown outfit with striped sleeves and socks. His body itself was grotesque, his long arms hanging down past his waist, and the way he was poised made him look almost boneless, like a rag doll. He let out a sickening laugh, as if to let me know he was pleased with my reaction to his work. He then turned around slowly in front of James and began to laugh even more at the horrific sight he made out. That was enough to shake me out of my terror. I snapped. "Get away from him, you bastard!" I rushed at the monster, raising the knife above my head, and I stabbed down at him. But as soon as the knife touched him, he disappeared into a cloud of black smoke. The knife passed right through and pierced James's still beating heart, splashing warm blood onto my face. No! What have I done? My baby! I killed my baby! I immediately fell to my knees, and I could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. My boy, my sweet baby boy. I promised Mummy would protect you, but I failed. I'm sorry, James, I'm so sorry. The police soon arrived to find me in front of my son, still wielding the knife covered in my baby's blood. The trial was short. Insanity. I was placed in the 𝚂𝚚 house for the criminally insane, where I have been for the past 2 months. It's not so bad here. The only reason I'm still awake now is because someone is playing Pop Goes the Weasel outside my window. I'll talk to the orderlies about it in the morning. Here we go. I don't know why I'm telling you guys this, but I guess I should introduce myself first. Hey, my name is Mitch. I'm here to tell you guys about an experience I had. You don't have to believe it. You can think it's one of those stories on the internet that people make up for attention or something, but I don't know if it was paranormal or whatever stupid words people use to describe the supernatural phenomena. But after that thing visited me, I believe in that paranormal trash now. It feels like a lifetime ago. Feels cliche even saying that. A week after I moved in with my brother, Edwin, after my house was foreclosed, I had finished unpacking. Edwin liked the idea of me moving in. Since we hadn't seen each other for 10 years, I was excited too. They say families are meant to be close, but I guess we had just drifted apart. This was meant to be our chance to reconnect and be how families are supposed to be, I guess. I soon fell asleep after moving in. I was exhausted from all the unpacking and it had just been a long day. After that 1 week, I heard rustling noises coming from outside at about 1 in the morning. I thought it was a raccoon or some animal, so I ignored it and tried to fall asleep. But the next morning, I told Edwin about it, and with a shocked look on his face, he agreed. The next night, however, I thought I heard my window opening and a loud thump, as if someone or something was entering my room. I darted up and looked around my room, but I saw nothing. I went back to sleep, hoping that it was just my imagination. The next morning, Edwin dropped his coffee cup when he saw me. He He held up a nearby mirror and I saw myself. A confused look on my face at first, but it quickly changed to horror as I saw the red of a gash on my left cheek. The blood still slowly dripping down my face. In my drowsy state, I couldn't feel it, but the dull pain was coming now. It would need stitches. After I was rushed to the hospital and stitched up, my doctor told me I must have been sleepwalking. I was about to question him, it seemed strange to me, but then he showed me something that made my blood turn cold. He lifted up my shirt to reveal a sewn up incision where my kidneys were. I stared in his eyes, my eyes widening. You see, look, I don't know how to put this, Mitch. You've somehow lost your left kidney last night. We don't know how. I'm sorry, Mitch. He had a confused look on his face. A man lost for words. He was out of his depth. He didn't know what to tell me. There was nothing he could tell me to comfort me. The next night was my breaking point. Around midnight, I woke to see a truly horrifying sight. I was staring face to face with a creature, with a black hoodie and a dark blue mask, with no nose or mouth, staring down at me. The thing that scared me the most was that it had no eyes, just empty black sockets. It was like looking into an abyss. I could feel the pain, hatred, and suffering. There was a black substance slowly oozing from out of the sockets, almost like tears, but more like blood. I grabbed a camera I had on a nearby mantle and quickly took a picture. I'd surely need the evidence, because who would believe me? This sounds like something from a story. After the picture took, the creature lunged at me and tried to claw open my chest to get to my lungs. I stopped it by kicking it in the face and scrambled to my feet, adrenaline kicking in. As I ran out of my room, I grabbed my wallet. I was going to need the money. I ran out of my brother's house into the night, and I didn't stop running. I eventually ended up in the woods near Edwin's house. I was so panicked I wasn't paying attention and I tripped on a rock. The last thing I remember was the ground rushing towards me, and then black. I'd fallen unconscious, and when I awoke, I was in the hospital. My doctor entered the room, the same one who had treated me before. I have good news and bad news, Mitch, my doctor started. The good news is that you had minor injuries, and your parents are going to pick you up. I sighed with relief, but that relief was short-lived. After looking at my doctor, I could see there was more to come. The bad news is that your brother... Your brother's been killed, Mitch. He was killed by something. Look, I'm so sorry. The doctor fell silent and just looked at the floor. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? My brother was dead, and nothing could bring him back. After I came to terms with what had happened, my parents took me back to Edwin's house to collect my remaining belongings, which I did. Upon entering my room, I was scared, but remained calm. I grabbed my camera, then stopped dead in my tracks. In the hallway leading to my room, I saw Edwin's body and something small lying next to it. I picked up the small thing and entered my parents' car, not mentioning Edwin's corpse. I looked at the thing I'd picked up and nearly vomited. I was holding my stolen half-eaten kidney with some black substance on it. The long road home seemed to go on and on. The road continued to outstretch in front of the vehicle endlessly. The light that shone through the branches of the tall green trees danced across the windows in random patterns, every once in a while obnoxiously shining in your eyes. The surrounding was full of deep green trees forming a forest around the road. The only sound was the sound of the car's engine as it travelled down the path. It was peaceful and let off a serene feeling. Although the ride seemed like a nice one, it lacked every form of nice for both passengers. The middle-aged woman behind the steering wheel had neat short brown hair that fit her complexion quite well. She wore a green V-neck t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans. Diamond stud earrings decorated each of her ears, which partially showed from behind her haircut. She had deep green eyes, which were brought out by her shirt, and the lighting seemed to make them more noticeable. There wasn't much significant about her appearance. She just looked like any average mother that you would see on TV shows and such. But one thing for sure made her different from those average mothers, and that was the dark bags under her eyes. Her facial expression was gloomy and sad, although she genuinely looked like someone who smiled a lot. She would sniff every once in a while, and occasionally glance back in the rearview mirror to look back at her son in the back seat, who was hunched over partially, his arms held tight around his chest, and his head pressed against the cold window. The boy lacked any normal appearance. Anyone could blandly see that something was wrong with him. His messy brown hair went in every which way, and his pale, almost grey skin was brought out by the luminescent lighting. His eyes were dark, unlike his mother's, and he wore a light t-shirt and scrub pants that had been provided to him by the hospital. The clothes he had worn before were so shredded and blood-stained that they weren't wearable anymore. The right side of his face bared a few cuts along with his split eyebrow. His right arm was bandaged up all the way to his shoulder, which had been shredded when his right side had hit the shattered glass. His injuries appeared to be painful, when really he couldn't feel a thing. He never could feel a thing. That was one of the glories about being him. One of the many challenges he had to face growing up was growing up with the rare disease that caused him to be completely numb towards pain. Never before had he felt himself get hurt. He could have lost an arm and felt nothing. That and another major disorder he had faced was the one that deemed him many insulting nicknames in the short time he had attended grade school before he was moved to homeschooling was his Tourette syndrome, which caused him to tick and twitch in ways he couldn't control. He would crack his neck uncontrollably and twitch every once in a while. The kids would tease him and call him Ticci Toby and mock him with exaggerated twitching and laughing. It got so bad he turned to homeschooling. It was too hard for him to be in a common learning environment with seemingly every kid poking or more like stabbing fun at him. Toby stared blankly out the window. His face was empty of any depictable emotion, and every few minutes his shoulder, arm or foot would twitch. Every bump that the car tires hit made his stomach turn. Toby Rogers was the boy's name, and the last time Toby remembered riding in a car was when it crashed. That's all he thought about, unconsciously replaying everything he had remembered before he blacked out, over and over again. Toby had been the lucky one, when his sister hadn't been so lucky. When the thought of his older sister came, he couldn't help but let his eyes begin to tear up. The horrible memories replayed in his mind. Her screaming that had been cut off when the front of the car was smashed in. It all went blank for a moment before Toby opened his eyes to see his sister's body Her forehead pierced with glass shards, her hips and legs were crushed under the force of the steering wheel, her torso pushed in from the late inflated airbag. This was the last thing he had seen of his dear older sister. The road home continued on for what seemed like forever. It took so long to get home due to his mother wanting to avoid passing the site of the crash. When the surrounding gave into a familiar neighbourhood, they had both been more than ready to get out of the car and step back into their own home. It was an older neighbourhood, with quaint little houses all next to each other. The car drove in front of a little blue house with white window panes. They both quickly noticed the old vehicle that was parked in front of the house, and the familiar figure who stood out in the driveway. Toby felt automatic anger and frustration take over him at the sight of his father who wasn't there. His mother pulled up the car into the driveway beside him before turning off the engine and preparing to step out and face her husband. "Why is he here?" Toby said quietly as he looked back at his mother who reached to open the car door. "He's your father, Toby. He's here because he wants to see you," his mother responded in a monotone voice, trying to sound less shaky. Yet he couldn't have driven up to the hospital to see Lyra before she died. Toby narrowed his eyes out the window. "He was drunk that night, honey. He couldn't drive." "Yeah, when is he not?" Toby pushed open the door before his mother and stumbled out onto the driveway, where he met his father's gaze before looking down at his feet with a stern expression. His mother stepped out behind him and met her husband's eyes before walking around the car. His father opened up his arms, expecting a hug from his wife, but she walked past him and put her arm around Toby's shoulder and influenced him to begin walking inside. "Connie," her husband began to say under a raspy voice. "What? No welcome home hug, huh?" She ignored her husband's obnoxious words and walked past him with her son under her arm. "Hey, he's 16, he can walk himself." His father began to follow them in. "He's 17. Connie glared back at him before opening the door to the house and stepping inside. "Toby, why don't we get you in your room so you can rest, okay? I'll come get you when dinner is ready." "Nah, I'm 16, I can walk myself," Toby said sarcastically and glared back at his father before stumbling up the small staircase and turning into his room, where he slammed the door violently. His little room didn't have much in it, just a small bed, a dresser, a window, and his walls had a few framed pictures of his family, back when they were a family. Before his father became an alcoholic and acted violently towards the rest of his family. Toby remembered when he was arguing with his mother, and he grabbed her by the hair and shoved her to the floor, and when Lyra tried to break it up, he pushed her, and she hit her back on the corner of the kitchen counter. Toby could never forgive him for what he did to his mother and his sister. Never. Toby didn't care how much his father beat him down. He couldn't feel it anyway. What he did care about was how he intentionally hurt the only two people he cared about. And when he was waiting in the hospital, where his sister took her last few breaths, the only person who didn't rush there was his dad. Toby stood by the window and looked out onto the street. He could have sworn he saw things out of the corner of his eye, but quickly blamed it on the medication he had been put on. When dinner time had come around and his mother called up to him, Toby came down the stairs and hesitantly sat down at the table across from his father and in between his mother and an empty chair. It was quiet as his parents picked at their food, but Toby refused to eat. Instead, he just watched his dad with a blank stare. His mother caught on to his stare towards his father and elbowed him slightly. Toby looked over at her slightly and looked down at his uneaten food, in which he didn't touch. Toby lay in bed, He pulled his covers over his head and stared at the window. He was tired, but there was no way to fall asleep. He couldn't. There was too much to think about. He had been debating on whether or not to follow his mother's instructions and forgive his father, or to continue holding a grudge with his boiling hatred. He heard his door creak open, and his mother padded into the room and sat on the bed next to him. She reached over and rubbed his back, which had been turned to her. "I know it's hard, Toby. Trust me, I understand. But I promise you, it will get better," she said softly. "When is he going to leave?" Toby said with an innocent tone in his shaky voice. Connie let her gaze fall down to her feet. "I don't know, honey. He's staying as far as I know," she replied. Toby didn't respond. He just continued to look forward at the wall, holding his damaged arm near his chest. After a few minutes of silence, his mother sighed, before she leaned over to kiss his cheek, and stood up and walked out of the room. "Good night," she said as she closed the door. The hours passed slowly, and Toby couldn't quit tossing and turning. Every time he let his imagination take over, he heard the screeching of tyres, the screaming of his sister, and he would uncontrollably jerk in bed. He threw off his covers laying on his back, and pulled his pillow over his face and cried into it. He could feel his chest rise and fall as he let out each shaky breath as he cried. He could hear his own pitiful weeping. He would have been screaming and crying if he didn't press the pillow over his face. After a few seconds, he threw the pillow off his face as well and sat up, hunched over, holding his head and breathing roughly, tears streaming from his eyes. He couldn't help but cry. He tried to keep it in, but he couldn't help but whine and whimper as he sat there shaking. He inhaled before he stood up and walked around his bed to the window and peered out, taking deep breaths, trying to calm down. He rubbed his eyes and looked out at the group of tall pine trees across the street. He stopped suddenly, and his gaze slowly centered on something standing under the streetlight. He heard ringing in his ears, and he couldn't look away. The figure stood beside the streetlight, about 2 feet shorter than it, long arms draped at its sides as it stared up at him with non-existing eyes. The figure had no features whatsoever, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, yet it held Toby's hypnotized stare, seemingly peering into his very being. The ringing in his ears grew louder and louder each second he stared, before suddenly it all went blank. The next morning, Toby woke in his bed. He felt different. He wasn't tired at all, and when he consciously woke up, he felt like he had been lying there, awake for hours. He had no thoughts flowing through his mind. He sat up slowly and stumbled over to the wall, but when he stood up, he automatically felt dizzy. He stumbled to the doorway and walked down the stairs. His parents were sitting at the table. His father was in tune with the small TV that sat on the countertop, and his mother was reading the newspaper. She quickly looked over when she felt Toby's presence looming behind her. "Well, good morning, sleepyhead. You've been sleeping forever." She greeted him with a hesitant smile. Toby slowly looked over at the clock and noticed it was 12:30 p.m. "I made you breakfast, but it got cold. I was going to wake you up, but I felt you needed sleep." Her expression fell from happy to worried as her son resisted responding to her. "Are you all right?" Toby stumbled over and sat by his father. He felt as if he was on idle and had no control over his actions. He was seeing everything he did, but it didn't seem to register in his brain properly. He reached out to his father's arm, but his hand ended up getting slapped. His father turned to him abruptly and pushed his chair over with his foot. "Don't touch me, boy!" he yelled. His mother stood up. "All right, knock it off. That is the last thing we need." The days went by and things continued on as they were. Connie spent most of her time cleaning up the house, and her rude husband spent most of his time ordering her around. It was just how it used to be before the crash. Toby never really left his room. He would sit there by his bed and tremble. His mind would wander, but his thoughts changed too fast to be remembered. He would pace around his small room like a caged animal, or stare out the window. The unhealthy cycle continued. Connie continued to be pushed around by her husband, being way too submissive to him, and Toby remained in his room. Before he could think twice, he would begin to chew on his hands, tearing the flesh from his fingers. He would gnaw his hands until they bled. When his mother walked in on him while he was doing so, she reacted horribly. She rushed him downstairs and grabbed the first aid kit, wrapping his hands in bandages. She demanded that he wouldn't leave her side from then. He isolated himself so much that he began to hate being around others. His memory grew glitchy as well. He'd start missing memory of minutes, hours, days, and so on. He would begin talking nonsense about things completely unrelated to conversations he would have. He'd go off about seeing things, sharks in the sink as he washed the dishes, hearing crickets in his pillows, and seeing ghosts outside his bedroom window. All the nonsense landed him in a counsellor's office. His mother grew too anxious about his mental health. She decided it would be good for him to talk to a professional about what he was feeling. Connie walked Toby into the building, holding his hand and guiding him in. She walked him up to the front desk and began talking to the lady who sat behind it. "Mrs. Rogers?" the lady asked. "Yes, that's me," Connie nodded. "We're here to see Dr. Oliver. I'm here with Toby Rogers." "Yes, right this way." The lady stood up and led them down a long hallway. Toby looked at the framed artwork down the halls and tuned into the sound of the lady's high heels on the hardwood floor. She opened the door to a room with a table and 2 chairs. "If we can get him to sit in here for a few minutes, I'll get the doctor." She smiled and held the door open. Toby stumbled into the room and sat down at the table. He looked over at his mother and the lady before the door slowly shut behind them. He looked around the room before he held up his tightly bandaged hands and began to bite at them in an attempt to unwrap his hands, but was interrupted as the door swung open and a young woman in a black and white spotted dress stepped in. She had light blonde hair and was holding a clipboard and a pen. "Toby?" she asked with a smile. Toby looked up at her and nodded. "Nice to meet you, Toby. My name is Dr. Oliver." She put her hand out for him to shake, but hesitantly pulled away when she noticed his bandaged hands. "Oh." She smiled nervously before clearing her throat and sitting in the chair across the table from him. "So I'm going to ask you a few questions. Try and answer them as honestly as possible, okay?" She placed her clipboard down on the table. Toby nodded slowly and held his restrained hands in his lap. "How old are you, Toby?" 17, he responded quietly. She wrote that down on the paper that was clipped to the clipboard. "What is your full name?" Toby Erin Rogers." "What is your birthday?" "April 28th. "Who is your immediate family?" Toby paused for a minute before answering her question. "My mum, my dad, and..." He stopped. My sister. I heard about your sister, dear. I'm really sorry." Her expression faded into a sad, pity-filled look. Toby nodded. "Do you remember anything from the crash, Toby?" Toby looked away from her. His mind went blank for a moment. He looked down at his lap, and in the surrounding he heard a faint ringing sound. His eyes widened and he froze in his place. "Toby?" the counsellor asked. "Toby, are you listening?" Toby felt a shiver go down his spine until he froze once again and slowly looked over out the little window through the door where he saw it. A dark, featureless figure peering in at him. He stared, eyes widening, the ringing growing louder and louder until suddenly the loud voice of the counsellor broke his trance. "Toby!" she yelled. Toby jumped and fell sideways out of his chair and backed up into the corner. Dr. Oliver stood up, holding her clipboard to her chest, a surprised look in her eyes. Toby met her eyes again, his breath hitching as he twitched. That night, Toby lay in bed, his eyes dazed as he stared straight up at his ceiling. He could feel himself begin to doze off when he heard the scattering of footsteps down his hallway. He sat up and looked towards the doorway, his door wide open. There was no light. Everything was lit by the luminescent blue glow of the moon through his window, leaving a cold lighting. He stood up and slowly made his way towards the doorway, when suddenly the door, which was previously wide open, slammed in his face. He gasped and fell back. He was out of breath when he hit the ground, and he began breathing heavily, his eyes wide open. He waited for a few seconds before getting back up on his feet. He reached out and grasped the cold door handle with his bandaged hand and creaked it open. He looked out into the dark hallway and tiptoed out of his room. The window at the end of the hallway lit up the darkness with blue moonlight as he padded his way down. He could hear footsteps rustling around him, and faint giggling mixed with the pitter-patter of small feet. It sounded like a child had run in front of him, giggling and laughing in the darkness. The hallway was a lot longer than he had remembered. It seemed endless, like the ride home from the hospital. He heard a door creak in front of him. "Mum?" he called out in a shaky voice. Suddenly a door slammed behind him and he jumped and turned around. He heard a long, eerie groan from behind him that seemed to croak right in his ear. He turned around as fast as he could, and suddenly he was face to face with none other than his dead sister. Her eyes were clouded white, her skin pale, and the right side of her jaw only dangling on by tissue and muscle, glass protruding from her forehead and black blood leaking down her face. Her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, as it always was, wearing her grey t-shirt and athlete shorts, which were dirty and spotted with blood. Her legs were bent in ways which they shouldn't be. She stood emitting a long croaking noise, only an inch away from Toby's face. Toby yelped and fell back. "Ah!" He started to crawl backwards away from her, not able to break eye contact he held with her blank, dead eyes. He dragged himself backwards until he backed up into something. He stopped for a second. Everything was dead silent, except for his heavy breathing and crying. He slowly looked up to meet the blank face of a tall, dark figure that stood over him. Behind the tall, dark mass were rows of children, looking to range from 3 to 10 years, their eyes completely black, and dark blood leaked from their eye sockets. He screamed and stood up as fast as he could, only to be tripped by dark black tendrils that wrapped around his ankle. He fell straight onto his stomach and got the wind knocked out of his chest. He tried to scream out, but he couldn't make a sound. He wheezed out before it all went black. Toby woke up with a start. He screamed out and sat up as fast as he could, completely short of breath. He wheezed out and felt his chest with his bandaged hands. It was just a dream. Just a dream. He laid back down in his bed and rolled over on his side. It felt like a giant weight had been lifted off his chest as he took in deep breaths. He stood up and padded over to his window. He saw nothing. Nobody was out there. No ghosts, no figures, nothing. He heard the rustling and coughing of his father out the doorway. His door was closed. He walked over and opened it, looking out into the hallway once again. He padded down the hallway and into the kitchen, where he found his dad standing and having a smoke in their living room. Toby waited a second and watched him from around the corner before a burning feeling started deep in his chest. Deep, boiling anger took over him. He heard the little imaginary voices in his head. "Do it. Do it. Do it," they chanted. He turned away and held his arms. He felt like he actually had control over himself, unlike he did for the past few weeks since he got home from the hospital. He actually had complete thoughts, where just moments before they were clouded by the chanting of the little voices in his head. Kill him. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. Kill him. Kill him. They continued on. Toby trembled. No, he wasn't gonna do it. What? Was he going crazy? No. He won't kill anyone. He can't. He hated his father, but he wasn't gonna kill him. That was it. The last thought he had before he fell into an idle state once again. The influence of the voices in his head was too much. He began to silently walk up behind his father. He reached over the counter to the knife holder in the kitchen and pulled out the largest knife that had been resting in a case. He gripped it in his hand. He felt a sensation take over his chest. He let out a snicker. He began laughing so hard he had to gasp for breath. His father turned around abruptly before he felt a brute force shove him to the floor. He grunted as the air was knocked out of him. What? He looked up at the boy who stood over him, grasping the kitchen knife in his hand. Toby, what are you doing? He went to sit up and put his arms out in front of him in self-defense. But before he knew it, Toby was on top of him. He went to grab at his neck, but his father reached out and blocked his hand by grabbing onto his wrist. Stop! Get off me, you little fucker! He yelled, and with his other hand threw an off-center punch towards Toby's shoulder, but he didn't stop. The look in Toby's eyes was not sane. It looked as if a demon had taken control over him. He yelled back and went to stab the knife into his father's chest, but he blocked him and grabbed onto his wrist once again. He went to shove him back, but Toby kicked out with his feet in front of him and landed a hard blow straight to his face. His father recoiled and pulled his arms away to cuff his face, but Toby got back up and drove the knife straight into his shoulder. His father let out a loud cry and went to pull the knife out, but before he could, Toby threw his fist straight into his face. He began to pound his fists into his head, laughing and wheezing. He cracked his neck and grabbed the knife and ripped it out of his shoulder. He drove it deep into his dad's chest and repeatedly stabbed into his torso, blood spilling out and getting splattered everywhere. He didn't stop until his father's body went still. He threw the knife over to the side and leaned over his body, coughing and panting. He stared at his smashed-in face and sat there twitching, until a loud scream broke their silence. He looked over to see his mother standing a few feet away, covering her mouth, tears running down her face. "Toby, why did you do that?" she cried. "Why?" Toby stood up and began to back away from his father's bloody corpse. He began to back out of the kitchen. He looked down at the blood-soaked bandages on his hands and looked up at his mother one last time before he turned and ran out the house. He ran into the garage and slammed his hand against the control panel on the wall, opening the garage door. Before he ran out, he saw his father's 2 hatchets that had been hanging on a tool rack above a table full of jars, filled to the brim with rusty nails and screws. One hatchet was new. It had a bright orange handle and a shiny blade. The other was old, with a wooden handle and a dull blade. He grabbed both and looked down at the table. His eyes met a box of matches, and under the table was a red gasoline tank. He held both of the hatchets in one hand and grabbed the matches and gasoline before running out of the garage, down the driveway and up the street. As he approached the streetlight that he could see out of his own bedroom window, he heard police sirens in the distance. He turned around, and the red and blue flashing lights came rushing down the street. Toby stood for a second, before he pulled open the cap to the gasoline tank, and ran down the street spilling gasoline everywhere. When the tank was nearly empty, he turned to run into the trees. He poured the last bit of gasoline out, and then reached into his pocket and pulled out a match. He struck it against the box and immediately dropped it. In an instant, flames burst out around him. The fire caught onto the trees and the bushes around him, and before he knew it, he was surrounded by fire. The silhouettes of police cars were visible through the flames as he backed away into the forest around him. He looked around, but his vision was blurred. His heart was pounding, and he closed his eyes for a moment. That was it. This was the end. Toby felt a hand on his shoulder. He opened his eyes and looked over to see a large white hand with bony fingers that was resting on his shoulder. He followed the arm that was attached to the hand up to a towering dark figure. It appeared to be wearing a dark black suit, and its face was completely blank. It towered over Toby's small frame and looked down on him. Tendrils reached out from its back. Before Toby knew it, his vision was blurred and he was surrounded by the sound of ringing in his ears. Everything went blank. That was it. That was the end. That was how Toby Rogers died. A few weeks later, Connie sat in her sister's kitchen. Her sister Laurie sat next to her, drinking a cup of coffee. About 3 weeks ago, Connie lost her husband and her son, and a few weeks before, she lost her daughter in a car crash. Since then, she moved in with her sister. The police were keeping her busy. They had just finished cleaning up the case, and the story had been released 2 weeks ago. The focus of the world seemed to have shifted to completely new issues. Laurie switched on the TV to a news broadcast. On the TV, the news reporter began introducing the new headline. "We have breaking news. Last night there has been a reported murder of 4 individuals. There are no suspects yet, but the victims were a group of middle school kids who had been out in the woods late last night. The kids had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death. The investigators have discovered a weapon at the crime scene, which appears to be an old dull-bladed hatchet, as you can see here." The picture changed to show snapshots of the weapon exactly as it was left on the crime scene. Investigators had pulled up the name of a possible suspect, Toby Rogers, a 17-year-old boy who a few weeks ago stabbed his father to death and tried to cover up his escape by setting a fire in the streets and the forest area around the neighbourhood. Although they had believed the young boy had died in the fire, investigators suspect that Toby Rogers may still be alive, due to the fact his body was never found. This is Helen, 14 years old. The dark circles under his eyes felt as if he had never slept enough. He doesn't care about his messy black hair, since he doesn't like to put too much effort into tidying himself up. It's unnecessary. His seat is at the back of the classroom, next to the window. He always sits there, drawing quietly, as it is like everything to him. He doesn't like to socialise with people, making him a lonely one. There was a person being pushed to the floor after school. That's Tom, who is always the victim of bullying, not because he did anything before, it's just the dislikes of people around him. These things happen often, and Helen is used to it. Though he does feel bad for Tom, he doesn't want to interfere, as it is quite bothersome. During recess, Judy says she is missing her watch as she searches for it. Helen doesn't help her, since it's none of his business. Suddenly, someone sees something flashing in Helen's bag. "What's this?" Ben says, as he puts his hand into the bag and takes out a watch that is trimmed with fake diamonds. Helen is very surprised to see it, as he does not know how it got in there. "Ah, that's my watch." Judy takes the watch from Ben after seeing the situation. Both of them stare at Helen with a weird glare. "It wasn't me," says Helen, who is still drawing in his notebook without raising his head a bit. "Yeah, right." Judy leaves the classroom with Ben as she concludes. The following day, as usual, Helen is sitting at his table drawing. He notices that the atmosphere doesn't feel right around him. People start whispering about him, and even a few start calling him thief. He doesn't decide to explain for himself, as he knows there's no point in it. It'd be useless to do so. As time passes, Helen becomes the new target, a victim for people to bully. Everything he does now is being exaggerated. He doesn't like it, but he doesn't resist.
I don't like him.
He keeps his feelings in his heart, keeping silent.
You hate him. Yeah, me too.
Until one day, Ben came up to him and snatched his notebook with his unfinished drawings in it. "Always doing these meaningless things," says Ben as he tears down a few pages of the drawings, tearing them into little pieces, wanting to see Helen's reaction. At this rate, the feelings he had been holding burst out. He punches Ben in the face and starts the fight. Helen isn't that strong, however, so he was beaten up in no time. Other students went to see the fight without stopping it. Some people even joined in and kicked him in his face and stomach. Right after the bell rings, everyone stops what they're doing and went back to their seats before the teacher came. Helen returns to his seat as if nothing happened. The teacher enters the room later on. "Oh my, Helen, what happened?" Helen has so many visible bruises on him that the teacher notices right after she enters the room. Everybody turns to look at him, waiting for him to give a response while glaring at him with a murderous look. "I fell from the stairs, miss," Helen replies as the glares disappear. After returning home from school, his parents also ask him what happened, and he responds with the same answer. The blue jacket he is wearing covers all the bruises other than the ones on his face. His parents believe it without doubt. Usually when Helen's parents ask him about how he is at school, he always says he's fine. He even lied about making a lot of friends, living happily every day. Helen refuses to tell his parents the truth, since he doesn't want to make his parents worry about him. A few months later, he has gotten used to the negative comments about him, and getting hit or humiliated has been a normal event for him. He is completely immune to these things now. Who framed him in the first place? Why did the culprit do this? This doesn't matter anymore. Nothing matters anymore now. "Hi, you there?" Helen receives a message from an unknown user on Facebook. "Who are you?" he replies. "I'm Tom, your classmate." Tom has never interacted with him before. This surprised him a bit. "What is it?" Helen says. Are you alright?" "It's none of your business," Helen concludes Tom's question. Tom types for a while before coming up with, "Listen, I know how you feel right now. You're in the same situation as I am. I really want to help you, but I can't. Sorry." Afterwards, Tom and Helen text each other for a long time, and Helen feels much better after telling him all the pain and the feelings he has been through. He can even joke around with Tom, often using smiley faces to show his happiness. This is the first time he thinks he has made a friend. It's in the afternoon, and the weather is unusually warm. "Come meet me on the roof after the first period in the afternoon. We need to talk, don't ask me why," texted Tom last night. Following his instructions, Helen meets Tom on the roof, waving his hand and walking towards him as he says, "Hey Tom, what's up my friend?" I have something to say. Something important," says Tom with a serious face. "Remember the watch thieving incident?" How could Helen forget about it? That was how he started suffering. Helen nods to show he remembers. "I was the culprit." Tom looked down, scared to look into his eyes. "What?" Helen is shocked. "I stole Judy's watch and framed you as the culprit." "Why did you do this?" "With you as the new target, the victim. My life is much better now." Tom smirks. "Can't you see that?" It's true, however, that when everyone decides to bully Helen, they won't bother Tom anymore. He's just like an abandoned toy. For him, that is totally perfect. As long as he keeps silent, he will be able to live his school life safe and sound. He succeeded. The plan was outstandingly perfect. Helen stood there silently, feeling betrayed and angry. He grabs the collar of Tom's shirt, and after pushing him around a bit, they end up near the edge of the roof. Both struggling in the fight, Tom slips and falls from the roof. Helen instantly grabs his hand and tries to pull him back up. But Helen does not have much strength. He tries as hard as he can to not let go, but his grip on Tom is loosening. "I'm so sorry, Helen." Tom falls. Helen closes his eyes, scared to look at what's going to happen. He cannot imagine what will happen to one after falling from a 6-story tall building. The sickening thud of Tom's body hitting the pavement will haunt him forever. After the police arrive, they have an interview with Helen. He was too horrified by the incident, however, to say even a word. Once again, Helen becomes the topic of discussion between students. Some people think Helen pushed Tom from the roof, but most of the others think that Tom committed suicide, and Helen failed saving him.
It's no wonder, really.
Because they saw him grabbing Tom's hand before he fell. That night, Helen was in his room crying, shivering, and he cannot stop the guilt from growing inside of him. He needs to calm down, and suddenly a thought flashed in his mind. It's not my fault that Tom died. He deserves to die. This makes him feel much better. and his guiltiness fades away too. Helen creepily smiles. Tom has had his punishment. I suppose it's time for others to have theirs, isn't it? His cries turn into laughter in the dark. Helen's classmates decide to have a party on the day of Halloween. But it's not to celebrate Halloween, it's just to have their friends come together to party. Of course, Helen is not invited to the party. The night before the day of Halloween, Judy and Maggie were messaging each other on Facebook. Both of them live in the school dorm, and Judy's room is next to Maggie's. 9:03, Judy. Who's gonna come to tomorrow's party? I'm so excited, smiley face. 9:03, Maggie. Most of our class will be there, but I texted Ben so many times, and even though all the messages I sent are read, he just never replies to me. The hell's wrong with him? 9:04, Judy. He's probably just working, I guess. 9:06, Maggie. Something weird is happening. I've been hearing footsteps coming from outside my door for a long time now. I think someone's walking around the dorm. 9:06, Maggie. Wait, I'll go check. Looking through the hole in the door, Maggie saw something unusual. 9:07, Maggie. Oh my god, there's a guy outside. He's wearing a mask and a blue jacket, and he's holding a knife, and he's all bloody. 9:07, Maggie. Fuck. He's knocking on my door now. 9:08, Maggie. Oh god, oh god, oh god. 9:08, Judy. Just calm down and find a weapon or something. 9:08, Judy. Protect yourself. 9:09, Maggie. He's turning the doorknob. Good thing I locked it. 9:09, Maggie. I'm scared. 9:09, Judy. Maggie? 9:09, Maggie. What should I do? 9:09, Judy. Maggie, listen. 9:09, Maggie. Save me. 9:09, Judy. Maggie, calm down. 9:09, Judy. Maggie? 9:10, Judy. Maggie? 9:10, Judy. You there? The message is shown as read, but Judy doesn't see Maggie's response. Suddenly, Judy hears the sound of her room door opening. The instant she turns around, she feels a terrible pain in her stomach. A bloody person who is wearing a mask and a blue jacket is standing behind her, holding a knife dripping with blood. Her blood. That night, all of the students who were in the dorm were murdered. No one knows how the killer did it. The murderer used the victim's blood to paint on the walls of the dorm, with most of the paintings being of a smiley face. Many of the corpses had been chopped up and mashed, possibly to get more pigment. Helen Ortis, the culprit, is still currently missing. However, in the chat room where Judy and Maggie texted each other, a message was written that responded to Judy's first message at 9:03. 11:15, Judy. Don't be excited about tomorrow, smiley face. because there will be no tomorrow. It was getting late as the man finally found a hotel to spend the night. He walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that on the way to his room there was a door with no number on it. She said it was locked and no one was allowed in there. She explained it was a storeroom and that it was out of bounds. She reminded him of this several times before allowing him upstairs, so he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight to his room and going to bed. However, the insistence of the woman had piqued his curiosity, so the next night he walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. To his dismay, sure enough, it was locked. So he bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom, like his, and in the corner was a woman whose skin was incredibly pale. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. Was this a celebrity? The owner's daughter? Why else would the woman at the front desk lie about this room? He almost knocked on the door out of curiosity, but decided not to. As he was still looking, the woman turned sharply and he jumped back from the door, hoping she would not suspect he had been spying on her. He crept away from the door and walked back to his room. Puzzled, he went to sleep. The next day he returned to the door and looked through the wide keyhole. This time, all he saw was red. He couldn't make anything out besides a distinct red colour, unmoving. Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying the night before and had blocked the keyhole with something red. He felt embarrassed that he had made the woman so uncomfortable and hoped she had not made a complaint to the woman at the front desk. At this point, he decided to consult her for more information. After some gentle quizzing, and the promise the explanation would go no further than him, she finally said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story of what happened in that room. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in there. We find that even now, people get uncomfortable staying there. But these people were not ordinary. They were white all over, except for their eyes, which were red.